As we start 2021, there are probably quite a few landlords thinking about their tenant sources for the next year. And this comes down to after a year where the rental market, the housing market, and indeed life as we know it in the UK has been very different because of the worldwide response to the coronavirus pandemic. A lot of landlords are reassessing what types of tenants they're looking to put in their properties over the course of the next year. And this is a moment where a lot of people are considering whether they should be looking at that social housing end of the market. Tenants who are in receipt of local housing allowance, universal credit, or potentially going direct to the local authority, a local housing charity or a local housing association to see if they might need this property for the overall social housing pool. Now, that's down to there's a big jump in the number of tenants across the country who are receiving some sort of social housing support, and a very real concern from landlords that there may be issues with some of the private rented sector and the ability to pay, especially as government support measures are wound down as we go into the second quarter and third quarter of 2021. Now, with the social housing market, we're still in the same position that we have been for a number of years in the UK, which is that there's just not enough provision from the local authority, from central government for social housing across the country. So it's been up to the private rented sector for a number of years to pick up the slack in that regard. And the majority of landlords, the majority of good landlords, will consider applications from social housing tenants. If you're not doing that, I'd remind you that legislation came in over the last 2 years, meaning that lettings agents, the property portals can no longer exclude social housing tenants, DSS tenants, local housing allowance tenants, from the application process for rental properties. You should be considering those tenants on a merits basis for your property portfolio in any case. If there is potentially a concern about affordability, then consider whether you need a guarantor as part of that tenancy. One consideration to bear in mind though is at the moment there is fairly strong affordability in the social housing sector, and that's because after a 4-year freeze on increases in the local housing allowance rate, in April 2020 those rates were allowed to be updated, and that was a welcome relief for many people renting to tenants in this area, but also tenants themselves, because there was a huge gap between affordability for social housing rents, local housing allowance supported rents, and where the private rented sector was. The bad news for those operating in this landscape is there's a new freeze being put in place for April 2021, and that's because the government is looking at the amount that it's spent on coronavirus support measures, and they're looking to claw some money back from somewhere. So there won't be an increase again to local housing allowance rates in 2021. The other thing to bear in mind is at the moment there's some additional support for people receiving universal credit and other government benefits at the moment directly related to the coronavirus crisis. And there's also been an announcement that that support will disappear from the 1st of April 2021. Now, in some cases, that might mean an extra £50 to £250 a month coming into a household as a result of these support measures. So that is going to cause a number of households to reassess their budget as well. So one of the things to consider, while social housing is likely to be a very stable market over the next 12 to 24 months, and especially if you have a contract available either from local government or a community organisation in the area that's providing housing to those who need it, that's a very solid guaranteed method of generating an income for a landlord and also doing some social good at the same time. If you're renting direct to tenants who are in receipt of benefits, do make sure you're updating your affordability checks either yourself or via your lettings agent with an eye to what's changing in terms of rates from the 1st of April 2021, because no landlord wants to be in a position where they're putting a tenant into a property where that property won't be affordable long term. Tenants also don't want to be in a position where they're taking on a property which is going to ultimately put them into arrears and result in an end to their tenancy through the courts. And we've got to remember as well that there's a huge backlog in the courts at the moment. There's a ban on evictions right now, and notice periods are 6 months. So you don't want to enter into a situation right now which may be 12 months to resolve through the courts legally, and be very, very difficult for both landlord and tenant. So just bear that in mind when you're looking at your social housing options for 2021.